Welcome to Go and Do, folks. I'm your host, Ajalon Joy Stapley, and last week I took my kid to the wrong birthday party. Correct venue, correct time, wrong day. Took a solid 20 minutes to figure it out. Here at Go and Do, we talk about politics, culture, family, and faith, and how they all connect from a faith-affirming, traditional value, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints perspective. This is episode 3. It is part 2 of our 4-part series on how wokeism is Marxism, repackaged, recycled, and ready to take down the West. Last episode, we looked at the birth of this theory from Karl Marx and how it was not just an economic system, but an entire worldview absent of God. We saw this theory put into practice to create communism in Russia. We saw Russia take over its neighboring countries to create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, or USSR, or Soviet Union. Now, Russia has its sights set on more neighbors, namely
Asia.
So today we're going to go through China, Vietnam, and Cambodia, and then we're going to do a quick jump over to Cuba. Just like the last episode, I want you to think about this as we go through these histories, how these ideas came into the country, or specifically, who did they come from and what do they have in common? What were they promising and what actually was delivered? And also today, we are going to look at the indoctrination or the psychological warfare that took place to convince common men and women to not just fall in line with communism, but to turn on their fellow countrymen and commit some of the worst things I've read about, all in the name of progress. And by countrymen, I particularly young people. How did they gravitate and grab hold to this ideology in such a violent manner? So we're going to start with China. We're going to go a little bit quicker than we went with Russia. I want to focus on a couple of their tactics that they use to brainwash young people. And then we're going to skim through Cambodia. We're going to skim through Vietnam and then dig into Cambodia and look at the brainwashing techniques that were done in Cambodia. And then we'll do an overview of Cuba, focusing on the left's love affair with Fidel Castro. Let's get started.
China
Didn't fall to communism until 1949, but just like Russia, the country had been a mess for quite some time. Let's rewind to the start of the 20th century. China had been ruled by a dynasty, which is a form of monarch, or basically a dictatorship. And this time period was marked by a whole bunch of rebellions and revolts against the dynasty. There were civil wars, famines, natural disasters. It was just a big fat wreck. However, in 1912, a republic was set up, showing a little hope for the people. Sadly, though, it was followed by more violence and instability and actual warlords. There was no unity, just warring factions and a lot of chaos and instability, which we learned from Russia is key to creating this Marxist revolution. Their neighbor, Russia, had succumbed to Marxism in 1917, about 40 years after Marxist ideas first entered the country. During this time, there was a movement, there was a reform brewing among young intellectuals in China who, just like in Russia, wanted to solve the country's problems. And they saw Marxism and now Leninism, from Vladimir Lenin, the leader of communist Russia. They found that those two ideologies answered their questions. They saw change, they saw hope. And in 1921, the Communist Party of China officially was started. It's 1921. And following that, two opposing forces emerged in China. You had the communists, and then you had what was called the Nationalist Party. And the Nationalist Party was kind of all over the place. It was the group that had overthrown the monarch, the dynasty. They ran the country at this time. They actually sought out help from the Soviets for support. They wanted to suppress, or they wanted to, yes, they wanted to suppress the warlords and unite China. And they wanted to strengthen Chinese identity while also doing away with some of the old Chinese traditions to usher in democracy. It's very similar to the provisional government of Russia, but leaders kept changing and corruption was happening, and not a whole lot of progress was happening at this time. So the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party were at war, official civil war with each other from 1927 to 1949. That's a long time. That is 23 years. However, 8 of those years were during World War II, and they weren't fighting each other. They had called a truce, and they were now fighting Japan.
Do you want to form an alliance?
That brings us to Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was born in 1893, raised in a wealthy home, the son of a former peasant who had gained quite a bit of wealth from his farming. He left home as a teenager to seek education, which he gained quite a bit of. He was particularly fond of Western literature and Western military tactics. Floated from police school to law school to business school, was kind of just a disaffected youth. Mao then went to work at Peking University as a librarian in Beijing, China. And Beijing at the time was the hub of intellectualism. And this is important because this is a pattern we're going to see over and over again. Even Marx himself, his radicalism really started to take off when he was at school in Berlin. And Berlin at that time was the hub of artists and intellectuals and innovators and thinkers and culture. And it was the same thing for Beijing during Mao's time. And as we talked about last episode, Second Nephi teaches us that to be learned is good as long as we hearken to the counsels of God. This is exactly what Nephi says. This is chapter 9, verse 28 and 29. Oh, that cunning plan of the evil one. Oh, the vainness and the frailties and the foolishness of men. When they are learned, they think they are wise, and they hearken not unto the counsel of God. For they set it aside, supposing they know of themselves. Wherefore their wisdom is foolishness, and it profiteth them not, and they shall perish. But to be learned is good, if they hearken unto the counsels of God. So while he's there at the library of Peking University, he meets 2 men who were founding members of the Communist Party, joins the Communist Party, ends up working his way up to be in charge of the Communist Party, and sets his sight for the government. During this time, the Soviets were aiding the Chinese Communist Party, setting up military academies, training their soldiers, or training their members to become soldiers. And they did this because, if you recall, Lenin was very clear from the onset that he wanted to spread communism throughout the world. They can't just keep the ideology to themselves. They want to spread it around, whether by force or not. But that is a main goal of communism. Back to China. 1936, Japan invades China in World War II. So these 2 groups, the warring groups, the nationalists who were in charge of the government, essentially in the country, and the CCP, the Communist Party, take a break from fighting each other, form an alliance, fight Japan for 8 years. 1945, as soon as the war ends, well, they start fighting again. Now, communism had already gained some footing with the peasants at that time in the rural parts of the country. And this was because they were quite downtrodden and beaten down. I mean, think about it. They had chaos. They had they had the dynasty, which wasn't good. They had a lot of fighting and chaos. And then the CCP and the nationalists are fighting and chaotic. And then you have World War II, which, if you're not familiar with what Japan did in China during World War II, it's awful. It's absolutely brutal. And as soon as that war ends and the Japanese leave, these poor Chinese people, just the average citizen, now has to experience more civil war. And my heart just goes out for them. It does. It really does. And that's what communism does. That's what Marxism does, is they latch on to real pain and real problems and say, I've got the answer. Here it is. So, now, was the Nationalist Party good for China? There's an argument to be made on both sides. The bad side is that they were seen to be a little too soft on Japan and a little more focused on the commies. They ruled somewhat harshly, like a dictatorship. Okay, that's bad. But they did create a constitution and they held an election within the government, so there is some good. However, the communists refused to recognize the constitution or the government, and you see the chaos continuing. And throughout this time, the Soviet Union is sending more money and spies to the CCP, who, without Russia's support, it's pretty certain that the CCP would have failed. So, after a series of horrible losses, the nationalists lost and the communists won. So, communism has now officially come to China. Enter Mao Zedong. Once in power, immediately he states that his aim was to create a socialist society and eventually world communism. So again, we see they want to spread the ideology. That's something that we need to know because we don't think about this in our cushy little modern America world. We didn't grow up with this. We don't have to think about it and worry about it, but there are forces who want to gain power. There are countries who want to see America fall. And we don't feel that or see that every day. Or, I didn't feel that in my youth and my childhood, but it has become very apparent now that this is the case. But first, he needs to transform China. And I'm going to focus on a couple tactics used to coerce people to their side. The first one was called land reform. Now, if you recall in Russia, as soon as the Marxists took over, they nationalized the industries, particularly the farming. So the government took it from the private citizens, banned private ownership, and then the government nationalized it, or they were now in charge of that, of the farming. So in this case, they confiscated the land from the owners. And instead of giving it to the government to run, they actually handed the land to the peasants who had previously worked the land. So they took it from the landowners, they gave it to the laborers or the workers or the peasants. They took it from the wealthy, and then gave it to the poor. And this started before the CCP had won the Civil War. It had been going on for a few years. It lasted 5 years total. And it was done intentionally to win over those peasants, right? So if you're out there taking the land from the landowners and you're giving it to those less fortunate, they're clearly going to side with the people who are giving them the stuff.
A group of Democratic lawmakers made a pitch to President Biden today, calling on him to use executive authority to ease the student loan debt for millions of Americans. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and other Democrats want the president to cancel up to $50,000 in federal student loan debt without any tax liability. They say the president could issue an executive order to make that happen.
And you may be thinking, that's the decent thing to do. This is what communism promises, right? They're following through on this promise to help the poor, to equalize the playing field. And now the poorest of the poor, we're going to be able to own land and right the wrongs maybe that had been done to them before. This is a good thing, right? The CCP is doing right by the working class. Nothing but good intentions here. Well, this is what Britannica Encyclopedia said about this. Said they saw land redistribution as an integral part of the larger struggle by encouraging farmers to seize landlords' fields and other property, strengthen its own support among the poor. Okay, so it's strategic, right? So they're trying to win over the poor, but they're still doing a good thing in the process while they do that, right? The point of the attack, this is the same quote from Britannica, the party leaders believed that to crack the poor people's age-old fear of the local elite and overcome the traditional respect for property rights, it required unleashing the hatred of the oppressed. I'm going to say that again. Unleashing the hatred of the oppressed. This is still from Britannica Encyclopedia. Teams of activists move through the villages, organizing the poor and speak bitterness meetings to struggle against landlords and nationalist supporters, to punish and often kill them, and to redistribute their land and property. Roughly 2 million landlords were executed. 2 million. It was quite the spectacle. The peasants and laborers would round up the wealthier peasants or the landowners of their village. They would physically take the deeds of the property. They take any stuff they could. They took their homes, divvied it up between themselves, and then they held this public grievance meeting where the peasants could one by one go and accuse the landowner, to right past wrongs and to look to the future. Speaking bitterness is defined as articulating one's history of being oppressed and exploited by class enemies, and thus stimulating others' class hatred. So James Lindsay, who I mentioned in the last episode, talks a lot about this. They're also called the grievance meetings are also called struggle sessions. And I'll put the link in below, and he talks about that at length in his podcast. I recommend it. So here we have some images to help you out. Armed guards take the landowners, throw them on the ground. They're encircled by large crowds. They point, they accuse, and it's a very highly orchestrated, emotive scene. And the thing is, it became so emotive that it wasn't just landlords who were getting thrown into this circle. It was anyone who people accused, essentially. And they were accused of crimes that were either real or imaginary. It didn't matter. And in some places, it said that 1 of every 5 people was branded a landlord, even if that wasn't true. And the other people in the village were too scared to say anything, right? To stick up for their neighbor and say, hey, no, I know that guy's not a landlord. He shouldn't be part of this. But they were too afraid. If you did that, you were accused of shielding landlords, which was a bad thing. Sometimes the meetings were fairly civilized and the land was taken, the deeds were taken, and then the landlords, were able to walk away freely. And it's not to say that there weren't any wrongdoings done by the landlords, by the landowners. There was some taking advantage of the peasants, and there were things that were not okay. But is this an appropriate punishment for that? Often the meetings turned violent and landlords were spit on, insulted, beaten, or even executed right there after the session. But unfettered emotion and hate can take you to some very dark places. And instead of being shot, some were buried alive, burned alive, dismembered, or strangled. Also, many landlords had their women redistributed, like their wives and their daughters. So you're starting to see hatred leads to mob mentality, or mob mentality leads to hatred, and it doesn't create anything good. This was an interesting fact. So these were very orchestrated meetings. The act of speaking bitterness did not come directly from the peasants themselves. They actually had teams from the cities come to the village to orchestrate these and to speak with the peasants one-on-one and to help them to confront the landowners to right the wrongs. This was called a thought reform campaign that was actually being launched by Mao in the cities. So he was focusing on teachers, intellectuals, the educated to basically purge them of their pro-Western ideologies. Because remember, communism does not like capitalism. Communism does not like the West. So at the same time, you have these land reform meetings going on in the rural areas. And then in the cities, you have a thought reform campaign where the party is trying to convince these educated folk to fall in line with the party. And it worked quite well. Many educated Chinese, thousands, usually teachers or students at the universities, joined these land reform teams and became activists. So you have a whole group of young intellectuals who want to make a difference. They want to help. They've heard horror stories and now they want to go out to the countryside and help these oppressed people find justice. Author Brian DeMere points out this tactic served to kill two birds with one stone by indoctrinating both the rural peasants and the city dwellers into the communist ideology. The work teams themselves were kind of a unique experience for these poor villagers. So you had these people who were working on behalf of the government. They were urban intellectuals. That was, it was unknown for these people. They hadn't experienced it. They hadn't met anyone like that. And so these teams come up and what are they doing? They're telling these people that you have been wronged. You are oppressed. We need to right this wrong, and I'm going to show you and walk you through how to do it. And when I first read this, I immediately thought of Al Sharpton's Jesse Jackson. Also famous community organizers like Saul Alinsky and Barack Obama. Now, if you're like me, you never heard of a community organizer until Barack Obama was elected. And I, at the time, had a lot of experience with Parks and Rec and education. And so when I heard that Barack Obama, before becoming a senator in Illinois, worked as a community organizer, I thought like a Parks and Rec director, like he was organizing, picnics and sporting events and, activities for children and elderly. That's what I pictured when I heard the term community organizer. No, this is what community organizer is. You go into a place and you shake things up and you help people recognize their oppression. You teach them to speak bitterness. You help them to awaken to their victimhood. I thought this was interesting. It said that women had a special role or an important role to play in these grievance meetings. The rural women, they were taught by the teams coming in, the activists, that they had a special kind of bitterness because not just because they were the lower class, the poor class, the peasants, but also because they were women. And the activists help these peasant women to prepare to speak in public. I thought this was really funny. This is a quote from an observer of these meetings from 1947. He said that at the land reform policy meetings, women function as great mobilizers when they speak bitterness. President Obama So from 1949 to 1953, this is the first 4 years of communist China. It's estimated that anywhere between 200,000 to 5 million people were killed between the deaths from the meetings, the land reform meetings, and squashing any dissent or revolutions. That's a big gap, but that's what I could find. There's not a what I learned about these Chinese death tolls is there's not great records because they're probably not super proud of this. After this, from 1957 to 1959, so this is about a decade after Mao Zedong had come into power, the government had to lead a campaign to silence the critics because people were not liking this. So any dissenters, anyone that was seen as a threat, was rounded up. They were publicly humiliated. They held these public struggle sessions, like the grievous meetings we saw in the villages, but they were doing this publicly all throughout China. People were condemned to prison camps or they were executed. And hundreds of thousands of people were killed during this time. When it came to China's economy, they followed the Soviet model, and just like it failed in Russia, it failed in China. So they had collected all the land, redistributed it to the peasants, and then they set their sights on business, private business. And they strongly suggest / forced the private enterprise to go into these joint state private firms to kind of join forces with the government. Not really join forces. It basically means that the government is now telling you what to do every step of the way. And then the government eventually took control of all the farms and land to nationalize the agriculture. Yes, the land and farms that were just given to the peasants, that were taken from the landowners and given to the peasants. The government now went and took it from the peasants, and now they were in charge of all the farming.
That doesn't make sense.
Then Mao has another great idea. In 1958, he launched the Great Leap Forward campaign. And this was meant to thrust China into the modern age when it actually thrust them into catastrophe. So the agriculture had been nationalized, and he wanted to change China from being a agrarian country into an industrialized society. So he wanted to go from nationalized agriculture to nationalized industrial. And how did Mao propose to do this? Well, China has a lot of people, so why not just force them to do this? And that's what he did. He moved millions of people from the countryside who were working the farms and shoved them into the cities to live in these communes and to work in whatever industry they were assigned to work in. And he did this in a very, very short amount of time. You can probably see where this is going. They didn't produce enough food out there on the farms, and the economy collapsed and a famine resulted. A horrible famine, horrible, unreal, actually. It was about 4 years long, and it's estimated about 45 million people starved to death. 45 million. Now, remember, last episode we talked about the death toll from the Nazis. They murdered about 11 million people. And this isn't a competition over who's worse. They're both horrible. However, we are much more familiar with the death toll of the Nazis and less familiar with the death toll from communism. And we need to be equally aware and understand both of these evil ideologies. So 45 million people died. Starvation, cannibalism was a thing. Not all of the deaths were from starvation. People were beat or killed or tortured for, rebelling against the government, for begging for food, for reporting the real harvest numbers, because the government wanted to keep that info from getting out. Refusing to hand over whatever food they had, just complete totalitarianism and death. It's estimated that 5 to 8% of China's population was wiped out during this time. And to make things even worse, the government knew what was happening. They knew very well that they were starving their own people to death. Mao was even quoted as saying, "When there is not enough to eat, people starve to death. It is better to let half of the people die so that the other half can eat their fill." So there you have it. All in the name of progress. So now it's the 1960s and things are not going so well for Chairman Mao. The economy is crippled. People are starving. CCP leaders are not happy.
Our pets' heads are falling off!
Mao knew he had to reassert his control over the party. And to do this, he called in the big guns. And by big guns, I mean impressionable youth. And by impressionable youth, I mean useful idiots. He starts the Cultural Revolution. And this is pretty bad, guys. This is pretty bad. This started in 1966, lasted 10 years till his death. So, just to give you a little comparison, this is what America looked like in 1966. Vietnam was raging. The hippie phase was taking over young people. The Beatles were entering their hippie phase. The movie Good, Bad, and the Ugly was released. And this is what these poor people in China had to deal with. So, the stated goal of the Cultural Revolution was to preserve Chinese socialism and purge remnants of capitalism. Remember, that's a whole goal. Capitalism is bad and socialism good. Also, Mao wanted to eliminate the traditional elements of Chinese society so China could move forward and progress. However, the real goal was simply to reinvigorate his communist revolution and strengthen the ideology within his citizens and weed out his opponents. So now we know capitalism is the enemy, but what about the four olds or traditional elements? Well, Mao identified what he called the four olds. It was old ideas, old customs, old culture, and old habits. And just like how in Russia, the state had to turn people's loyalty to them and away from religion and family, which is why they attacked religion and family, Mao wanted to attack those old traditions to get people to be loyal to the state. And he did this through propaganda. He criticized contemporary Chinese literature and art. He said it was bourgeoisie, it was anti-party, it was anti-socialist, it was capitalist. And this led student activists to form what was known as the Red Guard. And the Red Guard fancied themselves the face of this new revolution to rebel and purge against old China and bring her into the new, to the modern. So Mao convinced these people, these young, these enthusiastic, eager, idealistic youth to do his bidding. About 10 million of them did this. 10 million. And this is what it looked like. So, there they are. There's bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, just wanting to make a difference in the world so their country can progress. They wanted to, out with the old, in with social justice. They wanted to eliminate the foolish traditions of their fathers. Oh, that's not China. How'd that get in there? Now, just saying that, it doesn't look or sound that bad or disturbing, right? Just young people taking up the cause for their country, doing what they think is best. Okay, fine. But when you actually learn what happened, it is very disturbing. So the first group of young people to respond to Mao's propaganda and his dog whistles was in 1966 at a prestigious middle school for girls attached to Beijing University. Yes, you heard that correct. Where these girls beat and killed their principal. Yep, you heard that correct too. And when I first read about this, I was shocked, horrified, but I thought, okay, when I envisioned it, I envisioned like a mob mentality where, what you see at those grievance meetings, where you have a whole group and they get caught up in the mob mentality and there's a lot of emotion and rage. And then in that moment, they just one person, strikes the principal and then everyone else does. And then she's beaten and dead. Okay. That's horrible. That is horrible, right? That's not what happened. The girls reportedly went to this principal's home, left notes at her home about wanting to rip her dog's heart out. They beat her. And yes, it was a female principal at an all-female school. They beat her, dragged her to school, put her on stage in shackles, and then they forced her to kneel while kicking her and beating her with rifles. They then beat her with clubs that had nails in it. And she was forced to clean the school toilets, to drink from a dirty bucket. She was then shoved into a garbage can. And then 2 hours later, they brought her to the hospital where she died. It's gross. It's tragic. It's horrible. And it's not a one-time event in this revolution. So why did these girls attack their principal? Well, they had interpreted Mao's propaganda and dog whistles to mean that anyone in any position of authority was the enemy. The cruel irony is she was a member of the CCP. She was the party's representative at the school, but that didn't matter. Once people are so convinced that they are on the side of right and side of good, they are correct. Facts don't matter. Logic doesn't matter. Truth does not matter. They are good, and their assigned enemy is bad. So to these girls, that principle represented all that was preventing China from progressing. She represented the old China. She represented everything that was keeping China from moving forward into a place of progress. So the girls that started this movement referred to themselves as the loyal guards of Mao. And it caught on where 10 million of young Chinese joined in, and they, with Mao's full blessing, turned China upside down. They, across the country, students were denouncing and attacking their teachers and school officials, just like these girls had done. Now, I'm not going to read to you the specifics. I have in the links below the video, I have specifics. But just know that the cruelty and the barbarity that was done to this principle was done thousands and thousands of times over to different people. Even students as young as elementary age were participating in the torturing and the killing of the adults at their schools. They also ransacked homes and buildings to identify anything of these four olds to eliminate it from society. Books were destroyed, art was destroyed, museums, streets were renamed, religious artifacts destroyed. Does this sound familiar? The country was descending into chaos. And Mao used this time to target his political enemies and get them out of the way. By 1968, he realized that he no longer needed the Red Guard. So he sent the army on them and executed some of the top leaders. And people who weren't executed were shipped off to re-education camps in the countryside. So he let them do his bidding, turn the country upside down, commit these horrible, horrible, barbaric acts. And then when he was done with them, he saw no more use for them. He had them either executed or sent off to re-education camps. During this time, the death toll is debated, but between the Red Guard murders, forced suicides, a lot of people were being accused of these things, committed suicide instead of being killed. So it's estimated that between 1/2 to 8 million people died. The way that Mao discards of the Red Guard reminds me of Korihor from the Book of Mormon. He was an antichrist who led a lot of people away with false teachings, eventually admits that he was deceived by the devil, who he thought was an angel. He was struck dumb and then trampled to death and dies. And then we read in verse 60, thus we see that the devil will not support his children at the last day, but does speedily drag them down to hell. Or in this case, re-education camps. There's a couple women on the political scene right now who lived during Mao's Cultural Revolution, and they are speaking out emphatically about what they lived through and the similarities of what they're seeing here now in America. Lily Tang Williams ran for office in New Hampshire. And then She Van Fleet, they're both very active on X. I suggest you go find them and hear what they have to say. They both have written books, and they both are sounding the warning right now to Americans. Having lived through this, they're seeing the signs now, particularly at universities, and they are trying to warn Americans about what's happening. So don't just take my word for it. Go find them. Now, back to China.
China, China, China.
So China nowadays is very, very wealthy, as you probably know. So they got rid of those communist economy policies, adopted more capitalistic policies, which did increase wealth by a lot. However, they're not a free nation. It's been described as like a fusion of capitalism and oligarchies, where there's a lot of wealth, but only a few of the people in charge have the wealth, and there's very tight control on the citizens. Also, the Chinese government sits on the board of every company. That's a law in their country. So, like TikTok, for instance, there's a lot of controversy about TikTok, and people are saying the Chinese government owned TikTok. It's their company, which is why we shouldn't have it in America. And there's some people say, no, it's a Chinese company. It's not the Chinese government. It's the Chinese company. But by law, the Chinese government has to sit on the board of every company. So the Chinese government does have a hand in TikTok. But some more examples of the tight control happening in China nowadays. Their one-child law, where you couldn't have more than one child. They restrict religion. They imprison or force people into labor camps, particularly the Uyghurs, Muslims. Not sure how to say that. They have social credit scores where the government essentially scores your behavior, and then you're rewarded or you're punished based on the behavior that they think is good and bad.
What could possibly go wrong?
So back to Russia in the 1950s, Russia was struggling. However, at this time, China was pushing forward to spread communism throughout the world, particularly their neighbors. We're going to skim through Vietnam and then dive into Cambodia.
Good morning, Vietnam!
So the revolutionary leader in Vietnam was a man named Ho Chi Minh, and he was born in 1890. His early life is somewhat unknown. There's some reports that he was poor, some reports that he was wealthy. He was well educated. He attended the prestigious high school, the most prestigious high school in Vietnam, and then he traveled the world while working on a ship as a cook. He eventually made his way to Moscow, where he was trained there, and then he spent some time in communist China. So he was, in fact, a trained Marxist.
Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists.
At this time, Vietnam had been colonized by the French, and the French and the native population were at war with each other. That is until communist China infiltrated and shifted the fight between to be native population, communists against France. So when all was said and done, the parties agreed to a temporary division of Vietnam. The South Vietnam was led by an autonomous government backed by the French and eventually the United States. And North Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh, backed by communist China and Russia. And violence ensued quickly, leading to the Vietnam War. And there's three groups in the Vietnam War. There was South Vietnam, supported by the US, trying to maintain a non-communist government. Now, this was in the heart or during the heart of the Cold War, which we'll talk about next episode. So the US's interest in keeping countries from turning into communist governments was very high. So you had South Vietnam, and you had North Vietnam, which was led by the Communist Party by Ho Chi Minh. And then you had the Viet Cong, who resided in South Vietnam, but they were basically a fighting force aligned with the communists. So Ho Chi Minh was given the affectionate nickname of Uncle Ho, and he was portrayed as this kind, old, humble kind of grandpa figure. In 1966, he said, "Nothing is as dear to the heart of the Vietnamese as independence and liberation." That could very well be true. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. But by their fruits shall you know them. So, how did Uncle Ho go about seeing this happen? Well, murder, kidnap, torture of civilians was commonplace. It's estimated that the communists killed around 200,000 civilians during this time. So Uncle Ho so badly wants the family to reunite that it's worth killing a bunch of your children to see that happen. At the same time, about 33,000 South Vietnamese officials and civil servants were killed. So far more civilians were killed than people who were actual enemies per se. So after the fall of Saigon in 1975, almost 2 million Vietnamese fled, risking their lives mostly by boat. And the re-education camps were set up. A centrally planned economy was implemented, which led to shortages, just the usual. So that's Vietnam in short, very, very, very short. I want to spend time on Cambodia. And there's no funny movie clip to insert here because what happened in Cambodia was just so awful. There is a movie from the 1980s called The Killing Fields that portrays what happened. What happened was in just the span of 4 years of communist rule, a quarter of the civilization of the population was eliminated. This was a genocide. And if it makes you feel any better, it was all done in the name of progress. So the revolutionary leader for this was Pol Pot. Born in 1925 to a prosperous farmer, educated at some of Cambodia's most elite schools. Are you seeing patterns? And again, I'm not disparaging on intellectuals or education, again, but to be learned is good as long as you hearken to the counsels of God. Despite his family's despite his wealthy upbringing, he went on a TV interview once in 1977 and claimed that he was born to a poor peasant family.
I was born a poor black child.
He went to Paris on an academic scholarship and joined the Communist Party there in France. Came back to Cambodia, spent 12 years building the Communist Party there, took charge, launched a war on the government, took over 1975 there. Those are the cliff notes right there. So this is what America looked like in 1975, just to give you a little comparison. The Vietnam War had ended. The Watergate scandal was going on. The movies Jaws and The Godfather were released, and this song was popular on the radio.
Like a rhinestone cowboy.
And this is what was going on across the world in Cambodia. Pol Pot studied Mao. He described himself as a Maoist, and he did something really unique. He believed that all cultures and traditions must be destroyed and replaced with this new revolutionary culture, ideology. So anything tainted by the West, by capitalism, had to be purged. And they also wanted all members of society to be rural agricultural workers because they saw educated people living in the cities as tainted by the West, tainted by capitalism. So he instigated what was called Year Zero to set this all into motion. And then he ordered all the towns and cities to be emptied and people to move to the countryside to become these rural agricultural workers that he thought would purge them of their Western sentiments. So literally, it was grab your stuff and start walking. No one was excused. If you were sick, old, young, had a baby, didn't matter. If you refused to leave, you were killed. If you didn't leave fast enough, you were killed. If you didn't obey orders perfectly, you were killed. So they moved everyone to these communal farms, separated the families, and forced people to work very long days to start this new society over again. Mass executions, abuse, torture, malnutrition, disease were so rampant. So many people were dying. They were burying people in mass in fields and using that as fertilizer. Hence the movie, The Killing Fields. They got rid of money, religion, private property, all of that was abolished. Citizens were forced to wear the same black clothing. Because remember, you need to commit everyone to be totally loyal to the state. No individuality. You want them to be just loyal to the cause. They started a concentration camp that had been previously a high school. Very meticulous documentation of what went on there. Okay, interrogations, accusations of things that people hadn't done, torture, executions, all of it. About 20,000 men, women, and children were kept there. Lots of horrible things going on, but I want to focus specifically on these two tactics to indoctrinate people, to convince them to join the cause. So, what he did was he restructured the class system from haves and have nots and flipped it to favor the have nots and to punish the haves, or people he perceived as being the haves. The party's only acceptable lifestyle was farmers, agricultural workers. And so they were the have nots who were bumped up to now becoming the haves, or a privileged class. And the educated doctors, teachers, lawyers, people who lived in the cities, any of those professions were deemed to be bad. And they flip flopped. Okay, so that group was now oppressed, actually oppressed. They were killed, their extended family members were killed. It's reported that if you wore glasses or knew a foreign language, right, anything that was perceived to be a part of that group, killed. So what happened to the ones who weren't killed? Well, all of the people left the cities, moved to these communes on the farms out in the countryside, and the new lower class was basically starved. They were given very, very little food. Hundreds of thousands of them died of starvation. Some parts of the country, they were forced to wear certain color scarves to, so everyone knew who they were. Whereas on these same communal farms, the new upper class was given more food, were able to hold positions of power on these communal farms. They joined the Communist Party. So we have a very black and white class distinction. So the communists built on and created this animosity and this jealousy between these two groups of people to work in their favor. Now, this leads us into the second thing I want to talk about, which is the indoctrination of these young people into soldiers for the Communist Party. Formal education was done away with, and kids from about age 8 were separated from their families, brought to live in these labor camps, and taught that their parents were the enemy and that their true parents were the state. At these labor camps, these young people were forced to go to lifestyle meetings where they took turns finding fault with one another. It quickly turned into a witch hunt session where they were just accusing one another of being anti-revolutionary. That was the thing you didn't want to be labeled as, right? You didn't want to be labeled anti-communist or anti-revolutionary. And so they would sit in these circles and they would accuse others of being anti-revolutionary. It's very similar to what we saw in China. They were encouraged not only to criticize each other, but themselves. They had to put the microscope on themselves. And if you had been living in the cities, you were automatically seen as anti-revolutionary. So you see how this psychological warfare takes place. So a bunch of young people sitting there, separated from their families. You already know that this group is the bad group because they are the ones who used to live in the cities. They are designated as this different class, this lower class, and they're anti-revolutionary. So they are bad. And then you have the ones who are good. And not only are they good, but they have been mistreated and oppressed by this group. Not necessarily those people, right? And individual actions and actual character and accountability plays no part into this. If you are just labeled as the enemy, you're bad. If you are labeled as the one who was oppressed, the victim, then you're automatically good. This is what they did night after night after night. One survivor said, "We survived by becoming like them. We stole, we cheated, we lied, we hated ourselves and each other. We trusted no one," which kind of was the point. And the leaders at this time, the communist leaders, used this to educate and mold and basically create loyal party members. It's also said that the youngest of these children turned out to be some of the most brutal cadets for the Communist Party. Between the ages of 12 and 15, they appeared to be completely indoctrinated, which it's important to remember these were not zealot Marxists, these young child soldiers. Okay, they hadn't been taught Marxism or Leninism or Maoism at these prestigious schools. They were just simply indoctrinated through hate and jealousy and victimization to then carry out some of the most horrific tortures and murders. I'm not going to get into the specifics. It's in the sources. It's gross. These young, full of hate soldiers, child soldiers, identified their families oftentimes as the enemy, and they were encouraged to find fault when their parents and to spy on them. As one survivor wrote, the communists said they were creating a utopian nation where everyone would be equal. The whole nation was equally poor. But while the entire population was dying of starvation, disease, and hopelessness, the communists, the ruling party, the people in charge, the government, was creating a new upper class. This included boundless food, gold, jewelry, Western medicine, cars, motorcycles, silk, all sorts of things. 4 years later, Vietnam invaded and Pol Pot ran away to Thailand. So 4 years, a quarter of the population gone, a lot of hate fomented and released to create a lot of those deaths. Now imagine with me, if you will, rather than some young soldiers sitting in a circle at some rural camp in Cambodia, we have young adults sitting in an auditorium at a university. And instead of saying things like, well, your dad was a city dweller, so you're bad, and my dad wasn't a city dweller, so I'm good, imagine them saying things like, you have white skin, so you are an oppressor. I don't, so I am oppressed. Or you are heterosexual, I am not. So you are bad, and I am good. Or you are a straight female, whereas I am a Latinx, transgender, disabled, neurodivergent unicorn. This is DEI in a nutshell: diversity, equity, and inclusion. These people are assigned certain traits, therefore, they have the power that they need to share, that they should be ashamed of. And those who don't have those traits are the oppressed. Therefore, they are good. If you watched Matt Walsh's Am I a Racist?, you may be familiar with the last scene where it's very, very uncomfortable to watch. If you're not, let me just catch you up to speed. So Matt Walsh explores the grift that is DEI. It absolutely exposes that. So he goes to some online course to become a DEI coordinator, consultant, and starts charging people money for his services to tell them that they're racist, to either tell them that they are oppressed or they're oppressor. And he puts on this seminar with real life people who really thought they were attending a DEI seminar. And he goes through these different steps of how to become an ally and accept your racism, or how, if you're not a racist, if you're not white, how to, I don't really know what he does for those guys, actually, because that's not the point. The purpose is not to really help them. It's to foment jealousy and anger. So in this seminar, the last step is to become an ally and to speak out against racism. And Matt Walsh tells a story of an uncle he has who said something racist when Matt was a kid, and Matt was really uncomfortable, and he never said anything because he was too scared or whatnot. And so now, 20 years later, he needs to confront this uncle on his racism and stand up for what is just and right.
White silence is when we remain silent in the face of bigotry and racism. Now, what we like to tell ourselves is that as long as I'm not using the N-word, okay, as long as I'm not voting for Donald Trump, I'm not racist. By not taking action in the face of racism, we are participating in that racism. But here's the good news. It's never too late to break the white silence and speak up against racism. Things are gonna get really uncomfortable now, especially for me, because what I wanna do is lead by example. My Uncle Frank is here today. Can we bring my Uncle Frank out? Thank you, Ben. Uncle Frank, it was 20 years ago that you sat at the dinner table with us, and not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about this. You sat at that dinner table and you made what you said was a joke. You asked the question, what's the difference between a Mexican man and a picnic table? And the answer was, a picnic table can support a family of 5. Still laughing. We all laughed at the table. I laughed, but I was scared and confused, and I was a coward. But I'm not going to be a coward anymore, Uncle Frank. You had no right to make that joke. Latinx Americans, they come to this country and they work hard. And your little joke dehumanizes. It is not funny. Uncle Frank, it is not funny to mock marginalized people. It's not a joke. It's not funny. Uncle Frank. Okay, who wants to go next? Does anybody have some words for Uncle Frank?
In the behind the scenes, Matt and the staff explained that this was supposed to be the breaking point. This is supposed to be when humanity took over and people they didn't sit there and let Matt yell at this very sad looking person right there in front of them, which no one did. And then when Matt asked if anyone wants to say anything,
We're breaking the white silence here today. Number 6, you're of Hispanic descent. What are your thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts, but I just feel like they'd be wasted on him. But I do have one thing to say, if with your permission. You.
Yeah, man, you.
this is what indoctrination looks like. So that concludes our time in Asia. We are now going to jump over to Cuba and end there. But before we do, I just want to fly over Africa and say a quick hello. Because at this time, the communists were very much focused on Africa as well as the rest of the world, pretty much. And I didn't find as much info as I wanted to, so I'm not going to go into it here. But in The Naked Communist by Cleon Skousen, he talks about the Congo, and it looks just like all these other countries where you have someone who's a little more educated, secular education, learns about Marxism, is trained, goes back to the country, tries to overthrow and take over. So, but we're going to head over to Cuba.
Óyeme, Celia.
Cuba, like all these other countries, had a lot of instability leading up to this communist takeover. It was a Spanish colony as soon as Columbus stepped foot on it, and then America won it in the Spanish-American War. At the turn of the century, a lot of instability, a lot of revolts, a lot of power switching hands back and forth, a lot of corruption. Remember, chaos and instability is the name of the game for a Marxist revolution. Cuba was a little unique in that American tourism fueled its economy, the growth of its economy in the 1920s. So in the Roaring 20s, when the Prohibition was going on, a lot of Americans would go down to Cuba, and it was seen as a playground for wealthy Americans seeking gambling and nightlife. It was actually described as a mistress of pleasure. Havana was a mistress of pleasure for these Americans. So during this time, as power is getting passed from person to person, one person, General Batista, kind of landed in charge at this time in the 50s. And he wasn't perfect. He wasn't great. He actually was kind of bad, but he wasn't communist. And he had the backing of the American government. And this was in the 50s when the Cold War was going on. So not a communist was a good thing in the government's eyes. And at this time, 1957, Cuba ranked 4th among the Latin republics in per capita income. So the Cubans were doing relatively well. They drove American cars, owned TVs, shopped at department stores, so that tourism from America was funding a decent lifestyle for the Cubans. However, the Cubans were understandably growing tired of government corruption. So in 1957, a student-led uprising at the National Palace kind of started this communist revolution. Enter Fidel. Fidel Castro was the illegitimate child of a wealthy landowner. Now, he didn't enjoy any of his father's wealth or wasn't even recognized by his father until he was a teenager. But once he was, he attended private high school, law school, displayed reckless and violent behaviors as a youth. He committed not one, but 2 murders, and then another attempted murder. The Soviets recruited him to Colombia when he was an older teenager, put him on their payroll. When he was done doing revolutionary work in Colombia, came back to Cuba, and he rose as the charismatic leader of the rebellion. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Not communism or Marxism is our idea. Our political philosophy is representative democracy and social justice in a well-planned economy. That was Fidel in 1953. 3. So many different kinds of people fled to join Fidel in this revolution. Young college students, peasants, working class, full-fledged communists, and Argentinian Dr. Ernesto Che Guevara. This guy, you've seen this guy before. He has been immortalized on t-shirts as a symbol of rebellion and anti-capitalism. Okay. According to author Thomas Patterson, he says that Castro won the propaganda war in America thanks to a New York Times article that basically advanced his image as Robin Hood. The article painted Batista as a bad guy and Fidel Castro as the savior of Cuba. And it wasn't just a New York Times article. There were other American journalists and TV personalities who were singing his praises, including a couple of members of the government. And in 1959, Batista fled. Castro won. He was now in charge. Okay, so liberals in America celebrated this. They thought that, I'm sure some really did genuinely think that a constitutional government had come to Cuba, seeing as Castro was propped up as a savior. However, there was word coming from Moscow that they had supported the rebels in this endeavor. The actual Communist Party in Cuba was boasting that they were a big part of this rebellion. And still, liberal Americans were ignoring that, and they were supporting and excited about Castro. As soon as he took over, he sent 600 people to the firing squad. And as Cleon Skousen points out, American liberals describe this as harsh but deserved. Okay. A lot of the citizens of Cuba were catching on real fast. A bunch of them were hopping on boats and headed to Florida. It's estimated 500,000 Cubans left between 1959 and 1970. And then it starts. He outlaws private property. He transfers all private sector to the state. And there was a lot of U.S. companies there at the time, and he made them leave. And he took over their industry. He took over about $1 billion worth of American industry, and he couldn't operate it. So imagine the president or the governor. Let's look at it. Cuba's a small country. So imagine your governor takes over the manufacturing of cars in your state, takes over Walmart, takes over the clothing sector, takes over the farming. The government takes over all of those things in your state. And you're over there thinking, I've been to the DMV and it's kind of a crap hole. So why are you now in charge of all these other things? Because you're not going to do as good of a job as the private sector does, which they don't. And neither did Castro. So he couldn't operate any of that. He eliminated free press, got rid of any political opposition. He confiscated people's guns, did that. And of course, he killed people. So if you were not doing what you were told, if you were seen as a threat, if he didn't like you, if you were religious or a minority or homosexual, they sent you to concentration camps. These were headed up by Che Guevara. He helped establish all of them and ran one. According to defected guards, he loved to personally use his pearl-handed .45 automatic to shoot prisoners in the back of the head. What a man. That's a picture you're not going to see on anyone's t-shirt. Now, even after all of this that had been going on, American liberals still defended him. Until in 1960, at the UN, he embraced the leader of communist Russia And the world finally saw and knew that he was, in fact, communist.
Big communist, big communist. Huh?
Now, the aftermath of Castro's reign, thousands of Cubans were incarcerated, harassed, or intimidated. People were denied basic political freedoms. They didn't have freedom of speech. They did, however, improve healthcare and education. That's something you hear the left say even now. They did this while at the same time rationing toilet paper. So, you got to pick your battles. Basic goods were either in short supply or very expensive. So things like soap, food, clothes, books, transportation. During his 40-year rule, Cuba's economy did not improve. So when he took over in 1959, the GDP in Cuba was about $2,000. When 40 years later, in 1999, the GDP was $2,300. Okay. During that same time span, El Salvador went from $2,000 GDP to almost 4,000 GDP. So they almost doubled their GDP in those 40 years, whereas Cuba stayed the same. However, Castro was reportedly worth $400 million. Oh, no, I'm sorry, $500 million. It is worth mentioning the love fest that the media has with this man. When he died in 2016, at the age of 90, there was a New York Times headline that read, "Cuban revolutionary who defied U.S. dies at 90. A headline from Al Jazeera read, "Castro, the making of a legend." Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who, by the way, it's really hard to make Pete Buttigieg look masculine in any way, but I was watching an interview with Justin Trudeau the other day, and I thought to myself, my gosh, he makes Pete look like freaking He-Man. Okay. Justin Trudeau's just kind of he's kind of a character. He called Castro a remarkable leader. And this one is my favorite. This is from GQ. This is an actual article headline. I'm going to read it in my my NPR voice. Fidel Castro slept with 35,000 women and smoked his first cigar, aged 14. The dictator had a rapacious sexual appetite, according to a former Castro insider. The New York Post reported that Castro had sex with at least 2 women a day, at lunch, dinner, and sometimes at breakfast. His guards would prowl the beaches of Havana to recruit women. Prowl the beaches of Havana? Maybe they coerced them or perhaps just plain forced them. He was a dictator after all. Holy cow, GQ. I read accounts of women who accused him of just that. Basically being torn off the beach and raped. But GQ just loves the man. Loves him. Okay, that was Cuba. We're going to end on one more thing, and then we're going to go to our Go and Do challenge and happy thought. So, when you hear how communism took over all these countries, and they took over a lot more that I'm not going to get into, you see that they not only have a goal, world power, take over other nations to spread their ideology, but they also have a pretty well laid out plan. And by pretty, I mean it's very well laid out. We're going to go more into depth into that tomorrow or on the next episode. But I want to read some of their stated goals. This is from Cleon Skousen's Naked Communist. Highly suggest it. He was worked for the FBI in the 1940s. He lived through the Cold War, studied communism, and he assembled in his book a list of communist goals. And when I first read this a few years ago, I thought, holy crap, that is kind of scary how they've accomplished these. So there are about 50. I'm just going to read a few. Capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. Provide American aid to all nations regardless of communist domination. Grant recognition of Red China and admit Red China to the United Nations. Gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures. Get control of the schools. Soften the curriculum. Get control of the teachers' associations or unions. I thought this one was fascinating. Continue discrediting American culture by degrading all forms of artistic expression. Eliminate all good sculpture from parks and buildings. Substitute shapeless, awkward, and meaningless forms. Eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech. Present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy. Discredit the American Constitution by calling it inadequate, old-fashioned. Now, I forgot to mention this book was written in the 50s. Let me find exactly when it was written. 1958. This was 1958, folks. Transfer some of the power of arrest from the police to social agencies. Treat all behavior problems as psychiatric disorders. If you're familiar, part of Black Lives Matter's plan to abolish the police was to replace police going to these situations from 911 calls with social agencies or social workers. Encourage promiscuity and easy divorce. Overthrow all colonial governments before native populations are ready for self-government. Okay, there's more, you get the gist. So they have a very well thought out, laid out plan. It's not just a group of enthusiastic, zealot ideologues who are just taking their views and pushing it and forcing it onto other nations. It is a very coordinated attack on the West, on America. So at Go and Do, we want to edify, educate, and empower. I want to leave you with a Go and Do challenge, something that is manageable, something that is attainable, that you can do to feel like you're changing, you're doing something positive. And this is what it is. Ready? I'm going to piggyback off last episode's happy thought. My happy thought last episode was the Constitution of America. We know from Doctrine and Covenants the Constitution of the United States was inspired by God to set up a system that led to the greatest nation in the history of the world. We were the most freest, most prosperous, greatest nation in the history of the world. We need to learn about it. So, below this video, I have added several resources to help you understand the Constitution. Some are very, very basic. Some are more complex. Pick one, get started. And now on to our happy thought, which we need because that was a lot of heavy, heavy information that is extremely depressing. And that's kind of what happens when you look at the state of the world, when you watch the news. It's heavy, it's depressing, it can get you down. It makes me want to grab my kids and my husband and go live in a bunker somewhere and just wait for the Savior to return. But that's not why we're here. My thought is inspired from Esther. In the book of Esther, when she is told that she was born for such a time as this. The same goes for you and I. We were not sent here by mistake or randomly. God reserved us for this place and this time. This place as in America, the land where the gospel was restored, the land of freedom. This time as in the winding up stages of the world. The days when we are preparing to usher the return of the Savior. We're not put here by mistake. We can handle what is going on. We can handle what the world is going to throw at us because we have him. President Ezra Taft Benson said this in 1986 to the young men. He said, "You have been born at this time for a sacred and glorious purpose. It is not by chance that you've been reserved to come to earth in this last dispensation of the fullness of times. Your birth at this particular time was foreordained in the eternities. You are to be the royal army of the Lord in his last days. You are youth of the noble birthright." That same year, he said this to the young women. "You have been born at this time for a sacred and glorious purpose." Take comfort in knowing that you can handle it. You can handle it. God would not have sent you if he didn't think so. We just have to turn our lives over to him and let him show us how we can handle it and what our mission is and what we can do to help prepare the world for the Savior and to preserve this land for our kids. Thank you for being here. I'll see you next time.